My name is Jason Wallace. I'm pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley, and we welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. Before we get started, I'd like to invite you to worship with us Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street, Magna. We're currently going through the Gospel of Matthew. That's at 11 o'clock. We also have a Bible study Sunday evenings at 6 p.m. down in Orem at the Orem Community Church. We rent that facility on Sunday nights. It's at 130 North, 400 East. We also have a sister congregation, Berean Presbyterian Church, that meets in Ogden at 3350 Harrison Boulevard at 9 a.m. If you'd like more information about the church, you can give us a call at 801-969-7948. Well, one of the calls of a pastor is to, by the very name, to shepherd the flock that God has purchased with his own blood. It's right out of Acts 20. The Apostle Paul there warns the elders to shepherd the flock because he knows that after his departure, grievous wolves will come in and that perverse men will rise up from their own number seeking to splinter the church. Much of what I have dealt with over the years has been positive biblical teaching, but I've also tried to engage error, because there are a lot of false shepherds out there, there are a lot of false religions, and it's important to contrast the truth with error. It's not enough simply to teach the truth. It's not enough just to combat error. We have to do both. It's important to lead people to the truth because Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. Truth matters. There are things that are matters of opinion, in terms of people's personal preferences on things. There are things that are matters that God says are non-negotiable. The Apostle John, the beloved disciple, says that it is a non-negotiable that if people say that they are Christians but they deny that Jesus came in the flesh, they're not Christians at all. They're Antichrist. The Apostle Paul stood against the Judaizers, men who said they were Christians, and yet they were trying to teach another gospel that Paul said was no gospel at all. He withstood them. He withstood a host of others. It is important to see error. In recent weeks, I have been accused of persecution of people who call themselves Christians. I've been accused of that for years, for standing against the teachings of Joseph Smith. But I wanted to be clear. The reason that I stand against error is because I'm commanded to. I'm commanded to warn against error. I'm not the police running behind everyone, but I do have to teach what is true, and I have to stand against the things that are in error, as Paul stood against the Judaizers, as John stood against the Docetists, as there are others who don't claim to be Christians at all, try to set up a counterfeit to true Christianity. We've been dealing with things that call themselves Christian. Tonight I want to deal with something that says that not only are we wrong, and the Mormons, but basically everyone who believes in any God is wrong. And it's often presented so subtly that most people don't even realize that what they're watching is evangelism for another religion, because it is presented in the name of science. It is not science. It is religion cloaking itself in something that contains some real science, but a lot of religious belief that goes unscrutinized. What I want to look at this evening is the revival of the series Cosmos. The original Cosmos series was very popular, hosted by Carl Sagan, based on his book by the same title. Carl Sagan has been dead for a number of years now, and it was revived. And it was such an event, it premiered this last Sunday, that the President of the United States went out of his way to introduce it. And here's the introduction from President Obama.
America has always been a nation of fearless explorers who dream bigger and reach farther than others imagine. That's the spirit of discovery that Carl Sagan captured in the original Cosmos. Today, we're doing everything we can to bring that same sense of possibility to a new generation, because there are new frontiers to explore, and we need Americans eager to explore them. There are no limits, so open your eyes and open your imagination. The next great discovery could be yours.
Why would we worry about a TV show? I believe it is because Cosmos is important. It's important enough for the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world, to do an introduction to it, because it is basically evangelization into the religion that is being pushed by the state. It's telling to look at the people who have been involved in this. The producer of this is Seth MacFarlane. For those of you who have some sense of popular culture, he is the creator of Family Guy and American Dad and a host of other very coarse, humorous shows. Seth MacFarlane is an admitted atheist who despises Christianity. To give you a taste of that, he said, "Stay away from the church. In the battle over science versus religion, science offers credible evidence for all the serious claims it makes. The church says, 'Oh, it's right here in this book, see? The one written by people who thought the sun was magic.'" It is produced by an atheist. It was originally done by an atheist, and the new host, Neil deGrasse Tyson, is another atheist. A couple of quotes from him to give you a sense of where he's coming from. He says in his book, Death by Black Hole, he says, "As they are currently practiced, there is no common ground between science and religion. Although just as in hostage negotiations, it's probably best to keep both sides talking to each other." Then another quote from the same book. "Once upon a time, people identified the god Neptune as the source of storms at sea. Today we call these storms hurricanes. The only people who still call hurricanes acts of God are the people who write insurance forms." Cosmos has some wonderful presentations of real science. But we need to recognize that just because something contains science doesn't mean that it's objective. It doesn't mean that it's not propaganda. The Church of Scientology claims to be scientific. They have e-meters that they hook up to you, and they actually take readings of the electric impulses that come off of your hands. They wrap up a religion in the guise of science. And people think, well, this isn't religion, this is science. It's the Church of Scientology. That veneer is fairly thin. What I hope that we're going to see this evening is that the veneer for Carl Sagan and for the revived series of Cosmos is really not that much thicker. And that what's being presented is a religion. They are presenting science not for what science actually is, but as a disguise for a religion that is based just as much on faith as anything else, just as much as Hinduism or any other faith out there. We're going to open up the phone lines a bit early this evening. If you'd like to join in the conversation, the phone number here, 801-973-8820. That's 801-973-8820. And we're going to be talking about Cosmos, about the religion of scientism. I think it's important to recognize that there have been all kinds of religions that have been put forward over the years, and they wrap themselves up in what they consider to be science. Back in the 19th century, there were some sisters in upstate New York, the Fox sisters, and they claimed that they were communicating with the spirit of a dead man. people who hated Christianity flocked to them. Robert Dale Owen, a man who had totally rejected Christianity, very prosperous, influential man, embraced it. Horace Greeley, one of the foremost newspaper men of the 19th century, embraced spiritualism as rational, as scientific, as something that could be verified. And when it all came out that the rapping that they were hearing, that they couldn't find any explanation for with the people who tested these things, and they said, it must really be spiritual. The reality was that the sisters were cracking their big toes under the table, and that this is what was behind it all. But in their rejection of Christianity, they wanted to believe something as an alternative. The real alternative to Christianity is that there is no God, and that there is no purpose in life. There is no such thing as truth. There is no such thing as beauty. There is no such thing as purpose. The movie The Dead Poets Society had Robin Williams articulating the real end of this view. He says, all you do and all you are is nothing more than food for the worms. But then he made an illogical leap and said, therefore seize the day. That doesn't go over so well with people. What we find in Carl Sagan and in Cosmos is the same basic view of the world, that we're just on dust. He wrote a book called The Pale Blue Dot, showing our the total insignificance in the vast expanse of the cosmos, of us and this planet. From that, he then tries to argue there is no significance to us at all. He tries to argue that it is unreasonable to believe that there is a God, that we should be on something so small and still have significance. He says that that if there was a God, he would be malevolent, because why would he create a universe where we could see stars from so far away when the universe isn't that old? Most people don't listen to that. They don't think about how foolish that argument is. God has created a universe where we can see, scientists estimate, 14 billion light years away. And his view is that if there is a God, we wouldn't be able to see more than however long it's been since we were actually created. Anyway, this is the famous introduction to Cosmos was, the cosmos is all that is, or was, or ever will be. That's not a scientific statement. That's not a statement based on observation. It's not a statement that's falsifiable, because it's not testable. It is a statement of faith, a statement of religion. When we get into what Sagan and others believed, they set forth the scientific method with rigorous empiricism, where you take and you test and you falsify. And they talk about how wonderful science is, but then they presume that they can take science, which predicts things out into the future, that if water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level in San Francisco, California, and Savannah, Georgia, and Dover, England, that they think that at sea level in Bangkok, Thailand, it's going to boil at the same temperature. That's falsifiable. But when you start going into the past, this was the big debate between Bill Nye and the Answers in Genesis guy, whose name just escaped me, Ken Ham. It is one thing to take the scientific method, which we can apply to chemical reactions, to things like this. It's one thing to try to predict things into the future and test them, and if it doesn't work, know that that's not the case. It is another thing to take some evidence and project it back into the past and say, we know what happened. One of the important things to realize is that in the religion of scientism, where you assume from the beginning that the cosmos is all there is, was, or ever it will be, that what you are doing is you are assuming a closed universe. You're assuming that nothing has ever happened through any process that can't be observed today. That there is no God outside of creation who is acting upon these things. The funny thing is, they play a game. They say, we're scientists, we're rational, we're using the scientific method, and you're using faith. But their own presuppositions, the ideas they start with cannot be validated through the process they say is the source of all truth. There's some wonderful videos out online. The Magician's Twin is a study of C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, and also the author of 1984, George Orwell, in terms of their skepticism of science as a religion. The idea that all there is what we can test and observe. That's not provable. It's an assumption. And when you start with an assumption that rules out everything else, it's no surprise that the conclusion you reach supports the initial assumption. Thomas Jefferson, who was a hero to many rationalists, he heard stories about how people had seen meteorites fall. And he said, and this is the way that scientists can think. He says, I would rather believe that Yankee professors can lie than that stones can fall from the sky. I'm not going to believe it. I have a view of the world, and I'm going to make, things are going to fit within it. There was a wonderful book written back in 1964 called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In it, this whole idea of a steadily progressing science that's explaining all the things that go on around us in some kind of naturalistic way. That view of science where there may be gaps that we attribute to God, but eventually things like hurricanes, we find out they're just created by sunlight and the heating of the water, the heating of the air, and things like this. And there's a naturalistic explanation to everything. Thomas Kuhn goes through the history of science and shows that that view of science is naive and false. Kuhn is the one who invented the whole idea of a paradigm shift. He says, scientists don't come to data neutrally. There are no brute facts out there that are uninterpreted. Scientists come with a view of the world, and they tend to ignore things that don't fit within that paradigm. And that rather than this steady view where, we used to think that this was the cause of this, and now we know that there's a naturalistic explanation that doesn't need God. Kuhn did not follow this through to its logical conclusion. But he was writing about the history of science. He says this progressivist view is false. That rather what we have is we have a paradigm, we have a view of reality, and we tend to research based on that view. And then when things don't fall into it, we ignore them. And it's only when we are overwhelmed by the failure of our paradigm that then we have a paradigm shift. We move to a different view of reality. I'm going to look at some of this tonight. The phone number again, 801-973-8820. I think it's telling that the unreasonable, unscientific nature of both Carl Sagan and the new host, Neil deGrasse Tyson, is shown in the fact that both of them were ardent supporters of the idea of man-made global warming. The history of this, I think, is amazing. We have a host of people, many of whom are not trained in climatology, not trained in a host of other areas, but Neil deGrasse Tyson and Sagan were astrophysicists. And they have opinions on all kinds of things that they're not experts in. And they state them as scientists, as with great certainty. Tyson has mocked anyone who would question global warming. Let's look at the reality. In 1990, the International Panel on Climate Change issued a report, and it showed the average temperature over the last several hundred years. And it showed, this is the chart that's on your left side, and what they had, that big rise that's much higher than the present day, is what is known as the medieval warm period. You look at that, and I think the conclusion that most people would come to is that, yes, it has warmed up from the Little Ice Age, but it is significantly cooler now than it has been just a few hundred years ago. And there were no cars, there were no coal-burning power plants, there were none of these other things that are blamed for what is supposed to be a dramatic and catastrophic rise in temperatures. In 1990, this chart on the left was included in this International Panel on Climate Change's report. But when they came out in 2001 with their next report, you'll notice that the medieval warm period is gone. And what they have, if you'll pull that chart back up, if you look at the chart on your right, you'll see that from left to right, it goes over time, and it shows what Al Gore has called the hockey stick, that we have reached a point where the world is going to supposedly go into more and more rapid warming, and that from this mean, the 1990s were the hottest decade in recorded history. And since the major factor that most people would argue that has changed over those years is that CO2 has increased in the atmosphere. Is CO2 a greenhouse gas? Yes, nobody denies that. But are we going for a catastrophic change that requires massive governmental action and the limitation of individual freedoms, as were championed by Sagan and Tyson? Are those who question the reality of global warming anti-intellectual, anti-science, and religious fundamentalists who are off handling snakes somewhere in their spare time? No. The reality is that what changed between the 1990 and 2001 reports was that in 1995 a report came out primarily authored by Michael Mann, and he's the one who presented documentation to get rid of the medieval warming period that all the evidence before had established. And that became the new accepted reality. What had been the accepted reality before, the data hadn't really changed, but the study came out in 1995, and with a lot of pressure from a lot of different sources, Michael Mann's study was accepted, and it presented this hockey stick. It's called a hockey stick because it starts low and it goes up at an exponential factor. It doesn't simply rise slowly, it's spiking. The problem with this is that if you use real science and you study Michael Mann's use of data, you find out it's a farce. Stephen McIntyre and Ross McKittrick asked for the data because they were interested. First it was McIntyre, but then followed by McKittrick. They were academics. And what they found was that the science that was claimed for global warming really came down to the model that Michael Mann was using, and that whatever numbers you plugged into it, it would give you a hockey stick. That any data that showed a jump in temperatures received 390 times as much favor as one that didn't, or even showed a decrease in temperature. And so they took his mathematical model, which is the basis of all this global warming stuff over the last 20 years. They took that model and they plugged in random numbers. And here's 8 charts. 7 of them just have random numbers. They just had spit out of a computer. The 8th one is the one that Michael Mann claimed was based on real data. See if you can pick out which one was based on things really getting warmer. There you have 8 charts. One is supposedly based on real data, gets rid of the medieval warm period, and shows a spike in temperatures. The others are just random numbers. But the model that's supposed to be scientific is skewed. Real science can falsify things like this. Real science takes a prediction and it tests it. Over the last 15 years, we've seen no increase in temperatures. In fact, we've seen record low temperatures. There was a humorous thing a few months ago. A group was down in the Antarctic supposedly trying to find the melting ice. And there was so much ice, they got caught in it and had to be rescued. And the ship that was sent out to rescue them, they had to be rescued because there's record ice now. This isn't science. This is religion masking itself in a cloak of science. Mr. Tyson, I'm sure, is going to show some wonderful graphics of things that are real, that are examples of the wonder of God's creation. And the reality is, we are on a pale blue dot. We are less than dust in the grand scope of the universe. But the reality is, the God who created all these things has created us unique. The great truth of Christianity is that the God who spoke all these all these galaxies into existence is the one who was nailed on a cross for sinners. Sinners love to play games. The Apostle Paul talks about how we suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Scientism mocks Christianity and says, well, it's unreasonable. It's unscientific. We're scientific. Look at us. Do your presuppositions hold up to the light of, by your own standard? Well, no. Is there good and evil in your system? Well, no. Does that stop you from making value judgments about everyone else? No. These people, they use science as a scam. Does that mean that they don't really stand in wonder as they see the vastness of the universe, the complexity of it, the beauty of it? No. But they worship and serve the creature rather than the creator. There's a wonderful video that I would heartily recommend to you called The Privileged Planet. One of the arguments that Sagan made years ago was that the vastness of the universe shows that there must be all kinds of planets with all kinds of higher life. He wrote a book called Contact, where he imagined us having contact with a more advanced civilization. The reality is that when you start looking at the realities of what it takes for higher life in any form that we can imagine, that you have to have liquid water. You can't be too hot. You can't be too cold. You have to have a large moon. You have to have all these various things, because if you don't have them, you can't have life. At least not any kind of higher life, period. Imagining that there even was some kind of bacterial life or something like that. It's impossible. If our planet was, I believe it's 5% closer to the sun, we would not be able to sustain life on this planet. If it was 20% further away, we couldn't sustain life. If we didn't have a moon that balances the rotation, causes tides and all these various things, we wouldn't have the seasons, the stability of seasons that we have. When you start adding all these things up, the odds of there being another planet in the universe, if they generously in the video Privileged Planet said, let's just take these 10 that everyone has to agree are non-negotiables, and let's be very generous and give each one of them a weight of 1/10. The odds of having all 10 of these line up, it doesn't work out for there being other life in the universe. No higher life. When you look at the complexity of the simplest forms of life, you have Sagan saying that it's something that if all the information was put into a computer, it would be roughly 10 to the 28th power bits of information. There's a video that I would recommend you towards. It's done by Robert C. Newman, retired professor from Biblical Theological Seminary, where he critiques Sagan, and some of the things I've gotten have been from him. But he said, what would it take for monkeys hitting 3 keys a second to write Encyclopedia Britannica with a space in between? Not using anything but capital letters. We're not even talking about capitalization. How long, under random chance, would we expect? The number was astronomical. To get to the kind of complexity in the simplest forms of life, he ran the numbers and shows that it would take a billion monkeys working all the time that the universe has supposedly existed, according to Sagan, to even come up with the simplest form. A billion. And the numbers don't work. They have to posit things that fly in the face of everything that we know about physics. They have to have faith that the universe has a force that we've never seen, can't test. There's a force that made the Big Bang. That instead of matter just collapsing further and further on itself, it, for some unknown reason, exploded. And it's eventually going to collapse back on itself and then keep oscillating back and forth in very simple terms. That's not scientifically provable. But you go and you read people like Seth MacFarlane, and it was the original cosmos which helped convince him of atheism. That's the reason he signed on for this project. This is a man who is into gross out, coarse comedy of the worst sort. And he's the producer. Why? Because he hates Christianity. He hates the idea of God. We're going to take our first call. We have Mark from Salt Lake City. Mark, good to have you with us.
Yes, I remember hearing, years ago, Dr. Kennedy, D. James Kennedy, saying that evolutionists used that theory to excuse their own personal behavior.
Yeah. Basically, if evolution is true, everything is permissible.
Well, anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
Oh, thank you, Mark. If you'd like to join the conversation, the phone number here, 801-973-8820. Here's the conundrum. If there is no God, all things are permissible. So you don't have anyone telling you what to do. And for teenage boys who want to give themselves over to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, this is like, there's no God to tell me that this is wrong. Eventually, though, if they come out of their drug stupor long enough, they begin to realize there's no evil, but there's no good. Why bother? What purpose is there? The reality is that if there's nothing wrong with me hurting other people, there's also nothing wrong with other people hurting me. Or some of them try to argue for a libertarian view. Well, none of us should hurt each other. Why? Well, can't we all agree on that? Why? The Sagan, in the original series, loved to present caricatures of Christianity. Tyson, I understand, has been doing some of the same things. And they're very selective in what they do. We don't have to do guilt by association in terms of scientism and its fruit. Marxism was called scientific socialism. It was an explicit atheistic rejection of all religion, of God. It was based on Darwinism. Karl Marx wanted to dedicate the original Communist Manifesto to Darwin, and was persuaded not to because of some of the implications that would entail. But what did Soviet Union do? What did communism do? Did it bring good things? Communism killed over 100 million people and was the source of some of the greatest evil the world has ever seen on a scale unimagined in history, all in the name of atheistic science. Hitler was applying eugenics, Darwinism, the idea of selective breeding in trying to get rid of the useless eaters of society. Before he ever started gassing Jews, he was also, before the war ever took place, he was killing the mentally retarded, the chronically ill, and he was lauded in this country by people like Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, that this was science, this was reasonable. We needed to get rid of these Christian ideas of helping the feeble and the frail, and we needed to instead get rid of them so that we could have continuing evolution. They believed that religion was holding back natural selection, that in the wild, the sick, the old, they're eaten. And we needed to do the same. What's the fruit? The concentration camps. Carrie Buck. So many people don't have a clue that in this country there were panels set up by the government, eugenics boards, that they could declare you unfit. Carrie Buck was a mentally challenged young woman who got pregnant. And she was taken by the state of Virginia and forcibly sterilized. And the arguments from the Supreme Court in the Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of idiots is enough. What does Carl Sagan offer in contrast? He offers the killing in 410 AD, the killing of Hypatia. And he gives a falsified statement. Hypatia was a Neoplatonist woman philosopher. She was killed by people who called themselves Christians, which by 410, everybody in the Roman Empire was calling themselves Christian practically. But there was a dispute between the Bishop of Alexandria and the Roman governor. And she was an advisor to the governor. The governor had killed Christians already. And a mob attacked her as a counselor to the governor and killed her. This was a church-state issue at best. But he portrays this as this is what Christians do. Christians hate science. Christians hate reason. And Christians will kill you just like they did Hypatia. Never mind the fact that the only source that we have of the story of Hypatia is written by a Christian named Socrates, not the philosopher. This is hundreds of years later. But Socrates condemned what they did. In fact, most Christians of the time did. This is some mob that happened to be culturally Christian, and yet this is portrayed as this is what Christians do. And then he falsifies and says that it led to the burning of the library in Alexandria. Never mind the fact that the library in Alexandria had already been closed for 24 years prior, but facts don't matter. It's a religion. And so long as they mix it with some wonderful photography, wonderful graphic creations, and a nice smile and smooth voice, it sounds good. We have with us Richard from Kimmerer. Good to have you with us, Richard. Hello, Richard. Go ahead, Richard.
Glad to be here. Huh? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Anyway, I was wanted to make a comment about your comments about Carl Sagan, and And also, I watched the new series that's on now. The other a couple weeks ago when that was on the news, and it looked to me like it was nothing but computer graphics.
Yeah. I mean, there's some wonderful stuff from the Hubble Space Telescope and from Voyager.
And those scientists, they just ignore the truth.
Yeah, it's a religion, and
they call truth a lie.
Yes. And my frustration, Richard, is that a lot of people, they don't realize that there's a battle for their children's souls. They see that Cosmos is on. It's like, hey, kids, here's some science. Watch this. I mean, if the Church of Scientology was showing some neat computer-generated graphics and talking about some real science, but you knew they were going to be trying to get your kids into a cult that believes aliens brought other aliens here and threw them into volcanoes, would you really turn your kids loose with that? But we do it with Cosmos, we do it with the public schools, we do it with everything else. And then we get shocked when our kids believe what Carl Sagan's been trying to teach them. Richard, thank you for your call. Let me give you a few examples of the kind of what's been put forward in the name of scientism. Once again, I point you to the video. There's a very nice video done called The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis and his case against scientism. Well, before I do that, Sagan, he makes up things. Atheists love to talk about, what about the Crusades? You have people from Arabia who take over North Africa and spread, and then try to take over Europe. And they do it under the sign of the crescent moon. The people who fight back and try to retake the lands that had been captured from them, they did it under the sign of the cross. And they try to say, well, this is what religion brings you. No. We know what atheism brings us. We know what scientism brings us. It brings us Nazi Germany. It brings us Stalin. It brings us Mao Zedong. It brings us Idi Amin. It brings us the killing fields of Cambodia, and the list goes on and on. This is an evil religion. And yet it's presented in sweet tones with wonderful graphics. Do Christians love God's creation and seek to study it? Of course they do. I was privileged a couple of years ago, one of the elders in our small denomination was in town for a conference. He is the director of the Department of Energy's fusion project. Here's a man with a PhD in physics who's leading the search for how to do controllable fusion. We can do fusion in terms of blowing things up, but it gets kind of messy when you do that. But if they can actually control fusion, it's nearly unlimited power. He's an elder in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We're going to go to Kevin in West Jordan. Kevin, good to have you with us. Please turn your TV down, Kevin.
Yeah, Jason, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, one of the scary things about the religion of scientism is that we will send our children to their quote-unquote Sunday school Monday through Friday for 6 to 8 hours a day. Then they come into our Christian churches for maybe 1 or 2 hours on a Sunday. And we wonder why by the time a person is, say, 18, 19 years old, they're no longer coming to our churches, and their minds are so messed up, we can't convince them of Jesus or anything.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, they're re-education camps.
Yeah.
And
it's like, our government, they're always talking about the separation between, the church and the state. Well, if they really believe that, they wouldn't be pushing this religion upon everybody and teaching our children this religion. because it is a religion.
Yes.
You know, and I know, and you can't get people to understand that. And you send your children to be indoctrinated by this religion.
I mean, they showed an inconvenient truth in just about every public school in the country, and it's a fraud. Al Gore said back in 2008 that within 5 years. They've tried to get these things off the internet, but you can still find some of them out there. But in 2008, he said, within 5 years, we will have no North Polar ice cap during the summer. It'll be gone.
Yeah, and the science on that, there is no science on that. It's completely bogus.
But hey.
Anyways, yeah, I just had to share that with you.
Hey, Kevin, appreciate it. Come see us sometime. Folks, you're in a battle for your children's souls. It's really tempting. Send them to public schools for their secular education. Send them to some program where somebody else is teaching them. But then don't be shocked when something you didn't seem to take all that seriously isn't taken that seriously by them. We all come up short. I'm not the father I want to be. But fight for your children's souls. Don't send them to re-education camps where they're given Al Gore telling them that this is science. What has passed as science over the years, if you just study it, you don't have to read something like Thomas Kuhn's book, which is really hard to get through. Just go back and look in the this is Paul Ehrlich, author of The Population Bomb. This was passed as science back in the 60s. He says, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions are going to starve to death, and by the 1980s, most of the world's important resources would be depleted. He forecast that 65 million Americans would die of starvation between 1980 and 1989, and that by 1999, the U.S. population would decline to 22.6 million. So what, right? He was off a little bit. He said that those problems would be relatively minor compared to the rest. New Scientist, which mocks Christianity, the magazine, underscored his speech in an editorial entitled In Praise of Prophets. You go through Life magazine, 1970, was quoting scientists. By 1985, air pollution will have reduced the amount of sunlight reaching Earth by 1/2. 1970. They noted that though some people disagree, quote, but scientists have solid experimental and historical evidence to support each of the predictions, unquote. 1970, they said by 1985, half the sunlight's not going to make it to the Earth anymore. Funny thing is, did you know that the air is actually cleaner now than it was in 1970? More sunlight's getting through than before. Has the world warmed up? Yes, nobody denies that. Just as it warmed up in the medieval warm period and got cold. Scientists back 30 years ago were saying we're going to have a new ice age. And those who disputed that, they were called deniers. They were called all kinds of other things. It's funny to go back and read the predictions. There was a book published by Michael Oppenheimer and Robert H. Boyle called Dead Heat, which was supporting this whole global warming stuff. This is scientism. This isn't science. This is taking science and wrapping it around a political agenda because government's going to save us. Government led by scientists. We have a new Catholicism. We have a new medieval Catholicism. And its high priest are the scientists. Not the scientists who actually do real science like Jim Van Dam and others. No, the scientists who say that we need bigger government, we need more control. We need Carl Sagan saying that the government needs to be bigger to help people. stand on their own. But Michael Oppenheimer, who is Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School, Department of Geosciences at Princeton. This is not some quack, well, at least not from the sticks. Here's a quote from that book. By 1995, the greenhouse effect will be desolating the heartlands of North America and Eurasia with horrific drought causing crop failures and food riots. By 1996, the Platte River of Nebraska would be dry, while a continent-wide black blizzard of prairie topsoil will stop traffic on interstates, strip paint from houses, and shut down computers, unquote. Didn't work out so well, did it? Well, folks, we try to stand for the truth, and we try to stand against error. We invite you to worship with us at Christ Presbyterian Church, where we know the Creator of the universe has spoken. He told us how He did it. He created all things from nothing, and He still rules it all. We worship Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. at 8630 West, 2700 South. That's Main Street, Magna. Bible study in Orem, 130 North, 400 East, 6 p.m. And we have a sister congregation, Berean Presbyterian, meets in Ogden at 9 a.m. at 3350 Harrison Boulevard. If you'd like to get more information, you can give us a call at 801-969-7948, or you can go to our website, gospelutah.org. Until next week, we wish you the Lord's greatest blessings. Good night.